All right. Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on lessons learned from fatalities and major accidents. My name is Mackenzie Keller with the CST Pool, and I'm joined by our senior risk consultant, Kyle Brown. Today, we'll be going over case studies of some major accidents and how learning from these events can help prevent more tragedies in the future. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can put them in the chat so that our presenter can see them, and then we will also have some time for you to ask questions at the end. If you need to step away for whatever reason, the webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to everyone afterwards. So there's no need to worry about missing anything. Kyle, if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation. Um, Slideshow beginning. Perfect. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Mackenzie. As she mentioned, today we're going to be talking about lessons learned from major fatalities and accidents. Mackenzie did mention the question bar. I think about halfway through, maybe two-thirds of the way through the presentation, we are also going to be taking a quick question break where we will answer some of those questions that came through. So that will also be occurring. But one thing I want to start with before we dive into this is a really important discussion to have, and there's multiple layers to it. I'm sure part of this conversation might not exactly go the way we think it is, but anytime there's a fatality, there is a major incident that happens within a district or anywhere else. I think it's very important that we realize that it doesn't happen in a bubble. There are things that lead up to it. And while we do want to learn from those injuries, I think one of the best things that we can learn from it is they're all preventable. So as we go through this, think about how some of these incidents could have been prevented. I'm going to talk about some of the ways, and then I also want to challenge you to start thinking of things throughout your district, throughout your organization, of steps that you could take. What are our biggest exposures that could severely impact the lives of our teams, of our communities, of those around us? And what steps can we take to make sure that that doesn't happen? Sometimes it's learning from these case studies. Sometimes it's walking around your facility and just saying, what's the absolute worst thing that can happen in this scenario? And what can we do to ensure that we're minimizing that impact? So, in ways of risk assessment, we talk about risk management very much. And that's the reason why we're having this in depth conversation today, because the one risk we want to manage the most is the protection of our team. Because here at the CSD pool, being part of your loss prevention safety management team, our goal is to help you guys protect your assets. And in the words of the director of the Colorado Special Districts and Property Liability Pool, Joe DePep, our most important asset is our team members. And if we don't think that, then shame on you. So everything we should do should be to make sure that our most important assets, aka our teams, are safe. Personally, why this hits home for me, and I think it's very important to talk about. Growing up, I had two parents who worked in heavy manufacturing. I have visited them in the hospital when they were injured, but thankfully both fully recovered. But still, thinking of that perspective as a small child, it's something that nobody should really have to go through or anything they couldn't do. So, one thing I think that's very important when we're talking about safety and risk management is explaining the why to everybody around us. So, that's why I do what I do. It's to make sure that fathers, mothers go home, husbands and wives go home, whoever it may be. We all have somebody waiting for us, even if it's just our dogs, but we don't want them confused waiting for us. So that's why it's really important to learn from past mistakes and prevent future incidents. My goal at the pool level is to make sure that every member of the pool, whether it be a CEO level or a summer help whose first day, to make sure that they return home in the same way that they arrived. And some of the best ways to do this is looking at what happened in the past. We call those lagging indicators. And by planning for the future, we'll call those leading indicators. And we'll get into those a little bit more as we go through the presentation. All right, the slide skipping works, so we are all set. So some of the things we're going to cover today, now that we've talked about the high overview, we're going to go over some case studies of major accidents. Some of these resulted in fatalities. Some of these just resulted in life-altering injuries. I'm also going to add that some of these are going to be through or happened to members of the CSD pool. Of course, we're not going to give specific names or information. We're just going to give a broad overview of what happened. And we're going to talk about why it happened and some of the things that we can learn from those things. We're going to go over 5 different case studies today. Next, we're going to learn from those accidents. So, what do we learn anytime we have a major accident? And how do we approach the situation after it happens so we're learning from those? Because our whole goal is if something does happen that's awful, but we want to make sure it doesn't happen again. I think that's one of the most important things we can take from this. And then we're going to tie that into how do we prevent those future accidents. And one of the key parts to that is building a preventative culture. I saw a lot of familiar names on this guest list today, and a lot of you are members that we visited. So I'm sure that you've heard our team talk until we're blue in the face about safety culture. This isn't going to be a safety culture webinar, but we would really be doing you all a disservice if we did not bring up safety culture, because that's one of the best ways to prevent some of these major accidents. Lastly, we're just going to briefly go over some of the resources that we have here at the pool that are designed to help you guys prevent those major accidents. Sometimes it's going to be webinars like this, and it's also going to be covering some hands-on things that we can do to help you all. So, moving forward, we're going to go into our case studies. I have very little information on these slides, so you'll just have to pay attention to what we're talking about. The first one is it was a fatality that occurred in a metro district. So the background to this is we have a metro district and they have a lake that they run and they do some extracurricular, aka just things to do for the public out there on the lake. And I want to say that they had a frisbee golf course up, and this would be a wintertime event because the lake was frozen over. Now, they were building this winter wonderland attraction of frisbee golf, and what happened was the equipment they were using. So you had a member of the district who was driving a piece of equipment out on the ice, skidster to be specific. And what happened was the ice was not quite thick enough. The ice had a crack on it. I'm not completely sure on the details that led to that, but the skidster fell through the ice. And since we are working in wintertime attractions, the skidster had a cab on it. And what happened here was the cab prevented the individual from getting out, and essentially they were trapped inside the skidster. It is very tragic, and unfortunately, as I said, that did lead to a fatality. Now, some of the quick lessons that I think that's worth mentioning as we go through this. Was this the right equipment? Just doing a little bit of research myself because this was from quite a while ago and there wasn't great records, but your average skidster weighs somewhere around 7,000 pounds. And just from a quick Google, that would mean that 8 inches of ice would need to be present. So then you can ask yourself questions. Were there precautions taken? Were we measuring the ice? Were we checking for extra cracks? And then the other question always goes to, would it have been acceptable to shovel? And as we go through this, I think it's also really important to mention that these are all tragedies, and we are by no means, I apologize, I had a pop-up. We are by no means saying that anybody's to blame. We're just saying what could prevent them in the future. So maybe it would have been better to shovel by hand, and that's one of the common themes that I think we're going to come back to, is it seems oftentimes an extra 5 minutes would have completely changed the outcome, whether that's grabbing an extra piece of equipment, doing something that was a little more labor intensive. But again, we're not wanting to put blame. We're just wanting to take this as it did happen. Now, what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen in the future? Because something that I've started to use with a lot of our members, and I think it's really important, I encourage you all to use this phrase with your team as you're talking to them about incident prevention, about safety, is I want you to not think about today. I don't want you to think about tomorrow, but I want you to think about when you retire, whether that's next month, whether that is 30 years down the road because you just started your career. Is taking a 5 minute shortcut, doing something that's harder, going When you look back on the day you retire, are you going to be glad that you took that extra 5 minutes? Or are you going to be glad that you took all the steps that you could have to keep you and your team safe? So, moving on to our next case study, we had a fire district. Again, another member of the pool. They were doing something very routine, responding to a call. And part of this required to get up on the roof during, as part of the response, part of the actions that they take whenever they do respond. Whenever the individual was up on the roof, there was no tie off, there were no safeguards in place, there was really no controls other than hoping that your footing was secure. And unfortunately, just very similar to the way that it occurred on our first case study, this also resulted in a fatality because what happened is the individual, they slipped on the roof and they fell roughly 60 feet. And there's not really any coming back from that. Now, again, lessons learned. We go from, and I do want to also say, I know, especially in firefighting, not everything is routine, but it's always worth asking the questions. Was there something that could have been done? Was there a tie-off point that could have been used? Was there a rope lanyard that could have been utilized? Did you have to enter through the roof? So these are all questions that could be asked. Also, something else that's worth noting here is that individual was with their team during the time of this incident. So, thinking back to the statement that I made as we closed out the last case study, what are you going to think about in 30 years? So, let's go from a perspective of somebody else who was on that call or the individual who fell off the roof. It might be a little uncomfortable. They might get mad at you if you say don't go on that roof without proper protection, without proper supports to protect yourself. Now, whenever they retire in 30 years, do you think they were going to regret not saying anything versus if they would have? So that's where the whole thought process comes from, not just for you, but for keeping the rest of your team safe. And you also go into other questions like what was training, because that's something we're going to cover in a little bit. But I can assure you, each and every one of you, nobody goes into work saying, I want a major incident to happen to me today. Everybody comes into work thinking they're going to go home just the way they did. So it's really training you to put you in the mindset and help combat complacency within our districts. Moving on to our next case study. I was actually part of the pool for this incident that happened. I had been here for maybe 6 months. It was right around this time of year. It was very tragic. All of these are, but what happened is we had a water and sanitation district. And I'm sure you guys know if we have any water and sanitation districts joining us today. Believe I saw a couple that this time of year can be really hard on our water lines. Well, maybe not this year, but other years where you get that constant freeze thaw. It really makes things susceptible to breaks. So, what happened here is we had a district over the weekends and they were on call for 18 hours. They just could not seem to catch a break. They had one break after another break after another break. And it really was taking a toll on them. Like I said, I believe they were working for 18 hours straight, fixing multiple breaks. And what happens during one of these breaks for you all who do not live in the water and sanitation world, whenever a break happens, you have to dig up wherever it's at and you have to find the line and patch the line. This is to prevent issues with water and further damage. So during the last break that occurred, they dug the excavation to access the pipe. There was no shoring used, which is whenever you slope away the sides of the holes. So if you look at the picture here, this is a great example of a excavation with no shoring. And there was also no shielding. And what shielding is it's a steel box or some configuration of wood and hydraulics that holds up the sides of those excavations so that they do not collapse in. Unfortunately, the team was tired. They chose to not put in the proper things, and what happened is there was a collapse on the individual inside the excavation. And we do give an excavation training to our members. I believe we've given it to some of you, but whenever you have an excavation come down, a 1 cubic yard of soil can weigh about 2,700 pounds and it can come in at the force of 45 miles an hour. To put that into relative terms, that's about the same as getting hit by a Volkswagen Beetle. Um, Not really much recovery. This was also unfortunately a fatality. Some lessons that we learned from this is the district did indeed have shoring and just had not utilized it on this specific dig. They had had training on shoring, and it's one of those things I definitely, as a human, I can relate to it. You'd been out at work for 18 hours, you're tired, you want to get home, you're probably not making the best decisions because you've been working all day, but it's still one of those situations where if the individual had chosen, or the individual team, we just never want to put it on one person, had chosen to use shoring, that would definitely lead to a situation where that individual would still be here with us today. Some things that we learned from this case study, because again, our team was heavily involved on the investigation. They also had a policy to where shoring was optional. And it was basically put at the lead's discretion. After that, they completely changed that policy. So that's an example of learning from those mistakes. So they did take measures to make sure it didn't happen again. But really, what we're trying to encourage you all to do today is to look at the proactive side. So, what could we do to ensure that we're not doing a follow-up investigation and learning lessons from fatalities? We're learning things from past fatalities from others and past awful incidents so that we are not being on the reactive side of that. And I think it's really important to note too that water and sanitation districts, they do these digs all the time. And that's one of, I think, one of our biggest combatants when we're thinking about these things is complacency. And it's something I encourage you to all tell your members or your team this. Treat the thousandth time you've done something just like you did the first. Because I'm sure in this situation, if they would have treated it like their very first break ever, it would have been handled with a lot more caution, and we would not have had this happen. And again, we're not pointing fingers, we're just looking from lessons that we can learn from this. Moving on to the next one. So, this is going back to my professional life. My first, excuse me, this was my first job right out of college. This is not a special district. This isn't heavy manufacturing, but again, I think lessons can always be learned from it. So, what you see there in a picture is a crane. And if you look at the bottom of the cables on the crane, you see two large things, or one large hook and a smaller hook. Those are called snatch blocks. And basically, the company I worked for did precast. And what precast is it's concrete that's poured into place and it's poured into a mold and it can be shipped. So the idea is you're not pouring concrete in place. You basically just have concrete that's connected together at the job site. It's sometimes considered to be more efficient. But anyways, at the manufacturing plant, we would be dealing with 15-foot by 40-foot slabs of concrete, and you could imagine that gets quite heavy. So everything that had to be done via cranes. And as ironic as it sounds, the people who worked by attaching these concrete forms to cranes were called ground pounders. And one Saturday morning, there was an individual who was working on those. So basically, their job was to work with the operator of the crane. They would raise and lower the boom, the crane operator would, and then the ground pounder, they would hook the hooks of the crane to the concrete so that it could be moved. We did plenty of trainings on working around cranes, working around materials that are elevated above ground level. And one general rule we always kept was anything that you would like to keep, do not put below the crane or the load. I think that's a pretty straightforward answer. So, what happened on this Saturday, because our team was really good about that, there was nothing attached to the crane. So, they were just doing their general operations. So, that larger snatch block got hooked on the smaller snatch block. And basically, it broke the safety latch on the hook and caused the smaller snatch block, which, to give you all reference, I would still say weighs about 65 pounds, to fall 15 feet and hit an individual in the lower back. Now, This was not a fatality, but that individual was still permanently damaged for the rest of his life. He was walking around with a limp. Basically, he would never be the same way as he was whenever he walked into work that morning. And that's exactly what we're here to prevent. Now, this is a really interesting one because when we think about what caused this, what can we do? I believe that our first thoughts they go to, well, what can you do to make sure that a snatch block doesn't fall? And we talked with rigging experts, we talked with crane companies around the company, and it was just a freak accident. It was one of those things, if you tried to recreate it 10,000 more times, you probably wouldn't be able to do it. And that makes it a little interesting because we always want the simple answers, like on our last case study, put shoring in place that wouldn't have collapsed on the individual. So here you have to get creative because, of course, we don't want it to happen. And it is maybe a 1 in 10,000 chance, but I always encourage everybody to think in these mindsets of a 1 in a 10,000 chance seems pretty low. But one, what if you're that 1 in 10,000? And two, I have a job due to that 1 in 10,000. Because even if it is 1 in 10,000, if we can make sure that that one person still goes home, everything we do is completely worth it. So we had to get a little creative with our corrective action. So it used to just be you didn't stand underneath the loads, but now you couldn't stand underneath the crane. We taped off designated spots within the work areas. These are safe zones, these are no-go zones, because again, there is no way to predict or prevent that snatch block from catching. But what we can do is we can control where the individual is. So that's where the preventative actions comes into play. And even if it wasn't necessarily with that company, I hope that through our research, through our incident response to this, that a different organization was able to come up with a solution that maybe prevented something in the future. Moving on to our last case study. This one is, again, not a special district, but I do believe that it's worth mentioning because it is fairly recent. It happened in Colorado. And with a lot of our members, I know that we do this type of work and we have similar exposures. So this happened on August 20th of 2025. This was actually a dairy facility in Kingsburg, Colorado. What happened is they were doing a fairly routine confined space entry. They were going inside a manure pit, I believe, just to do some general cleaning, general maintenance. It didn't specify that in any of the case studies I read. I still think it was fairly recently enough, and since we're not directly involved, I'm just giving you the facts that I have. So what happened inside there? There was one individual working. They collapsed, and unfortunately, five other employees entered the confined space, and they in turn collapsed. Unfortunately, all five of them sustained to H2S or hydrogen sulfide exposure, and they were all killed by that. The reason why that's important noting is I know a lot of our sanitation districts, they have hydrogen sulfide exposure, and that's something that we typically test for. I was not able to see in my initial research if they had tested the air, but my guess would be no. But whenever we think about this tragedy, I do think of some things that could have prevented it. If they would have tested the air, they would have absolutely known that those H2S levels were too high. And just to say that one more time, because I know I'm speaking acronyms, H2S is hydrogen sulfide, which is a toxic gas that is often involved in the sanitation process. So in this case, it was livestock sanitation. But some things I think that are really important to note here whenever we give our trainings for confined spaces to our districts, and I'm sure a lot of you have sat through that or you've at least had us out for your teams, something we talk about and we stress it a lot is if somebody from your district goes down in a confined space, the number one thing you're not supposed to do is go in and try to help them. Now, I know that's counterintuitive, that's against human nature. I agree with that, but you have to think of it from a perspective of if your rescue teams are coming out and now they have two people to rescue instead of one, you've actually hurt your friend's chances of survival. So the question goes to, were these individuals trained? Did they know that proper procedure? or did their natural instincts just override? These are questions that we don't necessarily know, but we can still take some of those points and reiterate it to our teams, especially if we do similar entries. One other thing that I think is extremely worth noting for this case study is it's technically an agricultural operation. And you might be saying, Kyle, why are you telling me that? I think that there are some parallels to what we do in the special district world because agricultural is exempt from some OSHA regulations, just as special districts are government entities, therefore they can be exempt from OSHA regulations too. There's a couple misconceptions to that I would like to address with this as well. One, OSHA is the gold standard. They've already written the book, so we should be following it. Let's say that the agricultural place was not following the gas monitoring because they didn't technically have to. That's where best practice comes into play. And for those of you I've seen, I'll tell you this is what you have to do. This is the best practice. We should always be following the best practice whenever it comes to protecting our most valuable asset, aka our team. And a couple other things I want to say is both of these have both special districts and our agricultural, they have some bit of exemption from OSHA. But when you have a major accident occur, this Keenberg incident, that's exactly what happened. OSHA showed up and they began an investigation. Or if we go back to that trench collapse, OSHA showed up and did an investigation. So if we're not doing our due diligence to protect our team, that governmental immunity does not exactly count. So moving on from there, we're going to change gears a little bit. Maybe. There we go. Sorry, it seemed like it froze a little bit. So, some things that I think we can learn from all of these is one, they do not happen in a bubble. A lot of these actions that lead to this were probably not the first time, not saying that it wasn't the first time, but it is always possible. And we face dangerous things all day. It's not just, oh, these guys work in dairy operations, they have an exposure that I don't. We all expose things that could be potentially fatal to us every day. One example of that is how many of us drove to work. That is a very dangerous operation because there's certain things that we cannot control in those situations. Another thing to think is they can happen at any time. This is a story that I heard from a coworker in the past. And again, we always think of the fatalities as these big scary things. So what happened? They were doing a confined space entry. That's not something everybody does every day. That's not something your average office worker is going to be exposed to. We think about different things in those realms. But I also want to say, again, it could happen at any time, and even the most mundane task could be potentially fatal. This isn't exactly a case study because it was just a story told to me by a colleague, but in Pennsylvania, there was a mechanic. He owned his own shop. He was changing his little lettering for the holiday. I'm sure you guys have seen it where they have the little letters up there to say, happy holidays, happy Thanksgiving, whatever it may be. He was up on a ladder, lost his balance, fell down, and I believe that he fractured his forearm. Long story short, before he could get to the hospital to get it corrected, it formed some kind of blood clot that eventually led to the death of that individual as well. So these could happen at any time, and it's not only our big scary actions. And last is these are routine actions because I want you to kind of put it into perspective. The 5 case studies that we talked about, even though they may not be routine for you specifically, they were routine for those districts. That metro district, it wasn't their first time putting up this attraction. Our fire district, they go up on roofs during training. They go up on roofs during calls. It's something that's fairly common. Our water and sanitation district, fixing breaks is a pretty routine thing. I know some districts and they have crews, and that's all that they're responsible for is upkeeping the distribution lines. And then we go back into heavy manufacturing. When we're talking about that ground pounder who faced that very major injury, that was not something he did for the first time. His 10-hour shift, that's all he did. Like that was as routine as it gets. That's what he done from the moment he clocked in to the moment he clocked out. And at Kingsburg, I'm sure that that was also fairly routine. Again, with it being as new, I don't have as many in-depth details, but I'm sure that those will come out eventually. Moving on to our next page, we're going to talk about what we know. And I know I've already briefly touched on this, but I think it's very much worth talking and discussing. These people all started their day off thinking that they were going to go home at the end of the day. Nobody starts their day thinking they want to get hurt. Nobody thinks that the small corner that they've been cutting for so long is going to result in something so major. And I'll admit it, I'm responsible for cutting corners as well. Um, I'll tell on myself. So we are currently working on building a outside shop at our home, and we're doing some of the work on ourselves on the weekends, on the afternoon hours. And I was a little bit behind. So last night, whenever I got off of work, I was digging the trench for the footer that's going to be laid for this building. Come home, or I'm out working. It's dark. I have a flashlight that's shining inside the hole where I'm digging, and I hear just a little peep in the background, and I look around, don't think anything of it, start looking again, and then I look up, and my wife had actually fallen in a hole because I was not using proper lighting and I was working at dark. So that was me cutting a corner. Thankfully, she was okay. She just shook herself up a little bit, but it could have been so much worse. And that was one of those moments where I had to stop and think back. This could have been so much work. So we're no longer working in the dark. Other things to keep in mind is people's lives are always irreversibly changed. So if it's a fatality, of course, you're never coming back from that. But going back to our individual who was hurt with the crane operation, that person will probably never walk the same way they did before. And they were in their late 20s. So now they have to live with that for the rest of their life. But it's not just only are folks who are directly injured, it's also going to be those around them. What kind of psychological damage does that happen to the rest of the team? What does that do to the district itself? Because if we're talking about having people do a job, if that job just caused a major accident, who's going to be excited about doing that? Who's going to have trust in the district that you're going to keep them safe? So that's why it's really important to learn from these things and prevent them. And taking that a step further, you now have to cover that person's job and you have to take steps to protect them whenever this should have just been done in the first place, because it's easier to make a change when you're in the moment or beforehand instead of reacting to something, because then you have to worry about the individual and make sure they're taken care of on top of everything else, whereas this could have just all been prevented in the first place. So, changing gears here a little bit. What do you do after? There are four sections here. Two of these I'm going to actually dedicate a couple slides to, and the other two we're going to briefly touch on this slide. So, first off, incident investigations. It doesn't matter if it's a fatality, if it's a major life-altering injury, or if it's somebody stubbing their toe. I know that sounds a little ridiculous, but there should always be an incident investigation. We need to look into the causes of that loss and look into see what we can do to prevent future incidents or injuries. Next is our corrective actions. So, after every injury, that injury was caused by something. And then we, as our district leadership or whatever your role may be in the district, you need to have a question of, okay, that happened. That was awful. What do we do to make sure that it does not happen again? And what can we realistically do? Because that's something that our team does when we go out and we visit members is we like to give options, because I'll give you the option of I had $100 million to spend on this solution. What would I do? But farewell, very well realizing that that's not often practical, what can we do within our budget constraints? And that's something really important to look at. Look at other hazardous operations. So once you're in the mindset and you've seen this major incident happen, I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth mentioning again. What other operations do we have around the district that have a high risk of causing damage, of causing those major injuries that are going to be life altering? And what can we do to them? So Once you do that investigation and you have yourself in the mindset of we're looking to take steps to prevent future injuries, start looking at your other processes because that's how we begin to become proactive. And we're going to talk about that in more depth. Lastly, is discussing it at a safety meeting or an all employee meeting. Just I know in the past, and I'm not saying any of our districts are like this. Thankfully, I don't think I've worked with any, but in previous roles, it's when an injury happens, they try to brush it under the rug. Nothing happened. Let's not talk about it. That's absolutely what you shouldn't be doing because that happened for a reason, and everybody on the team needs to be educated by it. And it's also worth talking about too because you never know if maybe some of the people who witnessed this need a little bit of extra support to get through it. Maybe it was very traumatic for them, and if you didn't bring it up, you would never know about that. And I think it's also important to discuss it as a team too, because the more people that you discuss it with on your team, the more perspectives you're going to get, and that's going to further your incident investigation. That's going to further your corrective actions list and make them more encompassing. So now we're going to dive right into incident investigations in a little more detail. I think at its most simple form, an incident investigation should ask three questions. And I know I've probably used these three questions phrased a little bit differently for different processes that we do with our districts, but it's worth noting. So, what happened? What was the major injury? What caused it? And then why did it happen? What led up to this? Was there lack of training? Was it a freak accident like that snatch block falling? Or was it just something that we could not have planned for? Was it something we saw coming for a while? Why did it happen? And we're going to talk about the why here in a second because there are some ways to determine that. And third and most important, what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again? So, what are our corrective actions? What steps can we take to make sure that it does not happen again? Moving on to our next slide. So, why did it happen? Go through the five whys. Whenever I was taught the five whys, from a mentor of mine, I was told that you almost want to talk like a child. Just keep asking why until it's obnoxious. So let's use our Keensburg incident since it's the most recent and we're not going to have answers. So we're just asking questions like we're actually in the situation. So, why did those six individuals perish in that confined space entry activity? Question one, your answer is because there was H2S exposure. And then you can branch off from that. And then you ask another question, well, why was there H2S exposure? Why didn't they know about it? And then you can start diving in deeper, such as maybe they weren't trained in confined space. Why? Maybe their monitor was out of service and they didn't get it in, or maybe their monitor was malfunctioning. These are questions that you narrow down, and it's typically going to lead you to a corrective action, such as maybe they needed more training, maybe the equipment wasn't appropriate, or maybe it's something they didn't even think was a possibility, so they didn't look. So, again, ask questions until you dig down to the very bottom. And they call it the five whys. And that basically means you ask why five times until you get an answer. But I've been involved in investigations where you get an answer after three whys. And I've been involved in investigations where you get an answer after 20 whys. Because it just depends on the complexity and how much we know and how much is unknown. But that is a great way to start that process. Other things you can do in an instant investigation, and this should be done almost immediately. If there were witnesses, get those witness statements. What happened? Why did it happen? The more perspectives you get, you guys as leadership, as the people performing these investigations to get those corrective actions, the fuller picture you're going to have, and you're going to be able to give more direct answers as to what you found during the investigation. This one I put as number three, but we should have really covered it first. This is just kind of a tidbit for you guys because we're trying to keep everybody safe, but ensure there's no hazards present. Something that I think often happens, and it's something that was really hammered into our brains during my safety trainings, was Whenever something happens, you as the safety person, you want to go in, you want to figure out what's wrong. But whenever you're doing the investigation, when you're checking on individuals, when you're trying to do a follow-up directly after, the first and foremost thing you have to ensure is there's no hazards presence. So again, going back to that incident in Keensburg, had they made sure that there were no other hazards present, those other five would not have entered, and therefore those five would not have been exposed to the hydrogen sulfide. Next, we're going to consult a third party to assist. So what this does is, let's just face it, I've even faced this sometimes in my career, even with the background. Sometimes something's going to happen that's complex enough. You're going through the five whys and you hit a brick wall. You're not sure. They have third-party consultants that can assist with this. They have people who are specifically trained in incident investigations and incident response. And sometimes it might be best to hire that out because two reasons. One, you're going to get an expert opinion. Chances are they've seen something similar. And two, especially whenever working with something as emotional as a major accident or a fatality, they're you may not be thinking about it as clearly. There may be some bias in judgments, and this is the way to ensure that you're getting as straightforward as an answer as you possibly can. Next, moving on to corrective actions, because that's what we're really looking for, is what can we do to prevent future incidents? So we've answered the five whys, and let's say that we needed training. And training's typically the answer to this. You can see the third picture says training, training, and more training. Because if you train somebody in excavation operations and they get trained in it enough and you hammer in the dangers and the corrective actions, they're going to typically make the right choices. But you ask, what can you do to prevent future accidents? And it's not always necessarily going to be training. Sometimes it's completely changing an operation or changing a process in the way you do something. Something that I think is always worth noting here is maybe your corrective action is an SOP or a standard operating procedure. And for those of you who may not know what that is, that's basically if I'm going to do a task, let's say making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, it's going to show step one through getting the bread out of the cabinet, through step 60 whenever I physically put it in my mouth. Now, of course, for a sandwich, that seems a little ridiculous, but think about some of your operations at your district and think if there's a potential for a major accident. But if we highlight out every step that the individual should take when they're doing the action, then we've really reduced the deviation from our procedures, and therefore we've reduced the chance for major injury. Of course, it's still going to exist, but what we're doing is we're minimizing that. I briefly mentioned this earlier in corrective actions. Are these plans feasible? So, an example would be our firefighter who was up on the roof who fell off. If we had all the time and all the money in the world, it would be a firefighter doesn't go up to fight a fire on the roof until we install guardrails so they can't fall off. But when you're actively responding to a call, that's not feasible. So if somebody comes up with that as a corrective action, that's not really doing any benefit. But what we could do is we could say on the ladder that they use to get up, assuming it's a ladder truck, there's going to be a tie-off point. So even if they do fall, they're only going to go 6 foot and not 60 foot and hit the ground. I hope that that makes sense to everybody. And when we make corrective actions, we want to train on them. And whenever I say train on them, train on the specific procedures, train on why we are having this training and what we're going to change. Next, preventing future accidents. I took a little longer than I thought, so we're going to skip through the first round of questions and we're just going to save those for the end. So, the best way to prevent future accidents is you learn from the large injuries that happened at your district, those case studies that we talked about today. Next, we learn about the small injuries, and I'm going to tell you why we learn about the small injuries. Because, again, not all these happen in a bubble. Typically, there are leading indicators of we've had a bunch of small injuries, we are at risk of a large injury. Because the more small, the higher the possibility for the large ones. And next, you learn from injuries that never happened. One of our colleagues, Brennan, had something he likes to say is the best way to prevent your next injury is to make sure that you're studying, doing that incident investigation, and creating corrective actions for the injury that didn't happen. And what that does is it puts you all on that proactive side because now we're preventing things instead of reacting to things. And next is learn from your peers. And that's why I threw in a couple case studies that weren't special districts and didn't exactly come from us, but learn from your peers. If you know of another, let's just say you're with a library district and you hear of a major injury that happened at a library district, learn from that. Take the case study, reach out to them and say, what happened? That's awful. What can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen to our team now? Because it doesn't always have to be things that involve you guys. You learn from others because anybody, I'm sure, it doesn't matter if it's your district, it doesn't matter if it's completely other type of entity. We all want to make sure that our team's kept safe. So you learn from things. You take that case study of the incident in Keensburg with the confined space entry and you look back at your confined space operations and say, do we have any potential for a hazardous gas exposure, even if it's not exactly the same? So, next, creating a proactive culture. And this is something that I highly suggest our members do is create a near miss program. So back to that point, the best way to prevent your next accident is studying the one who didn't happen. And what we think of as a near miss program is things that could have happened but didn't happen. So the example for this, you see the cord at the bottom. And I use this because it doesn't really matter what type of entity type you're with, you have an exposure of tripping on cords. So let's say somewhere in your office there's a cord that goes across the floor because that's the best way to plug in the printer. Every time you step over that cord, that's technically a near miss because you have the possibility to trip. So the whole thought process behind this is for every 300 times I step over that cord, 30 times I'm going to trip on it. And out of those 30 times, one time I'm going to trip, fall, and injure myself. And you might be saying, well, what does this have to do with major incidents? Well, that one time may be a major incident because even if it's just tripping over a cord, you might land wrong and need a shoulder surgery, and now you never have the same range of motion. But the way you protect yourself, your team, is let's say that first person who walks over that printer cord. They say this is a trip hazard, we have to do something about it. Next thing you know, the other 299 times didn't happen. Therefore, there were not 30 people tripping, and also there was not one person who tripped. Another way to think about this is everything that you find and fix through a near miss program, that's an injury that you've prevented. That's an injury that will no longer occur. Encourage the reporting of hazards. Encourage your team to look out for these things. And one thing I like to say is important too, develop some kind of stop work program. So let's go back to our excavation dig. If there's an individual who doesn't feel comfortable entering an excavation, for whatever reason it may be, they should have some kind of code, some kind of process to where they can stop work, discuss it with everybody, and they're not entering a situation they don't feel comfortable with until it's resolved. We used to have this at my last company I worked at. It was a safety coin. Every employee was given one during their orientation, and it had the company's logo on one side, and the other side it said something like, "The people I work for are waiting for me at home." The idea was is it didn't matter if you were talking to a coworker who did the same job as you or the CEO of the company. If that coin came out, we stopped and we discussed safety. That's really creating that proactive culture, creating that mindset, so we're preventing those fatalities. So we're preventing those major injuries because, again, it might take 5 more minutes to discuss the safest way to do something or to tell somebody you're not comfortable without more training. But if you think about it on the day you retire, are you going to be sad that you had that conversation? Or are you going to be sad that you didn't have that conversation and maybe spend a week in the hospital? So that's where this all comes into play. You have to look out for your team and for yourself. And as our district leadership, because I'm hoping that a lot of us are leadership, but even if you're just the leader of a small group team by being like a safety champion, creating a proactive safety culture is extremely important. Ask for input. Ask your people what keeps them up at night, what they think the biggest risks are, or is there anything that they can improve? Follow up. I think this is incredibly important because if you're not following up, people are going to eventually stop giving you recommendations. I think that's the best way to kill morale in a safety program is to ask people what they think, ask how you can help them, and then just don't do anything about it. I'm not saying you have to agree with every suggestion they have, but you should always at least follow up and say, "We understand where your concern's coming from, but we don't necessarily think that that's the most practical idea right now. Here's what we're going to do instead, and here's how it will still address your issue. So just make sure you're following up and be present. Never be somebody who's too busy to hear about a safety concern that a member of the team has. And also for being present, be an example. Because I always say, as leadership of the district, if you don't care about safety and you don't care about preventing these major accidents, the minor accidents, the fatalities, why should the rest of your team? So be the example for culture that you want to see within your district. And wrapping that up, we're going to go over some resource. So you obviously have us as the safety consultants for the CSD pool. We're here to help you guys with those injury investigations. We're here to help you guys conduct hazard assessments so we could see where those major potentials are. Again, we're never going to hit everything, but we try to catch the most obvious ones. And we're also looking to start presenting safety shares. And what this is going to be is we're going to take incidents that happen throughout the pool, kind of similar to what we did today, and we're going to cover those three questions and share them with you. So, what happened? What was the major injury? Why did it happen? And then what can you do as a district to make sure that it doesn't happen to you? We also have a new software that we're planning on bringing out to you all in 2026. It's called Prepares. It allows us to do online hazard assessments. The nice thing about this is we're all very busy teams, and this allows people to kind of fill out these hazard assessments at their own paces and create corrective actions. Because again, if we can create a corrective action for nothing that happened, we're being proactive, and that's what we want. Next is loss analytics, something we present to people when we go out is what do your last 5 years of losses look like? And you can look at trends and you can see, oh, slip, trips, and falls are a major issue. So then we can start developing plans to prevent slip, trips, and falls or minimize them. And we also have loss analytics for your entity types as a whole. So what we mean by that is would be, let's say your top cause of losses, slips, trips, and falls, but maybe all cemetery districts, their major cause of loss is lifting. So then you could look and say, we don't have lifting injuries, but how do we make sure that we don't get future lifting injuries? I went a little past my goal, but do we have questions? I believe that I am done chatting about
Yes.
this.
If you have questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat. We do have one question, it looks like, from Hunter Freeman. Hi, Hunter. Um, is there a secret sauce to build a positive culture, or what would you say are the most important aspects of building a positive safety culture?
Yeah, if I could just put it into three quick words, it would be education. Educate your employees, train them so that they know what they can do, what they can't do. Next is accountability. You have to have some kind of accountability. If somebody's going to cut those corners and put themselves and their team at risk, they need to be held accountable for that. Or if you have a management team who doesn't put safety as a priority, how are we going to hold them accountable so that we can improve that culture? And the last is going to be recognition. So it's kind of the flip of accountability. We also want to hold people accountable when they're doing something good. We want to recognize that. We want to celebrate our successes. So whenever somebody comes with a good near miss that's going to prevent an injury and protect the team, we want to celebrate that and we want to tell others about it so that they continue to do those things as well.
Looks like we've just had another question come in from Alex. For metropolitan districts that have pool facilities yet can't afford lifeguards, any recommendations for best practices?
Yes, Alex. You see right here at the bottom of the screen, there's a safety at csdpool.org. I will tell you, you are definitely not the only metro district who has that come up. We have a list of best practices that we help districts with, and that involves things like security cameras if possible, and just general things. So, please follow up with an email, and I'll make sure we get that list over to you because it's definitely something that we have worked through before with members.
Okay, we'll give it one more second to see if any more questions come in. In the meantime, for anyone who wants to watch this all over again or feels like they missed something and want to go back, the recording will be sent out to people after we have it recorded and available. So no need to worry about that. And as Kyle said, if you have follow-up questions for us, please reach out at safety@csdpool.org. We're more than happy to get into contact with you. I'm not seeing anything else come up at the moment. So I think that'll be it for today. Kyle, thank you so much for presenting for us. As
Yes,
always,
thank you, everybody.
very educational. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I hope you all have a good day. And like I said, feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions. Have a good day, everyone.